thank you very much for introducing your research to me initially and making this event possible. You've been making the rounds. There's a lot of interest in this research, I know, and it's certainly justified. You've been doing a lot of talks at a variety of different kinds of venues, and we're delighted you found time in your schedule to present to us. Kenneth Yin teaches language, literature, linguistics at the City University of New York. You did your undergraduate at Cornell, do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, undergraduate at Cornell and PhD at Georgetown. You've received grants from, I don't know why I'm addressing this to you, I should be addressing it to the audience. Kenneth has received grants from all the illustrious places one would want to receive grants from, including the ACLS, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities. The list goes on and on, the Davis Center at Harvard. And he's published widely, but his latest book is Dungan Folktales and Legends, which was published last year. And he's, to my knowledge, the first scholar writing in English, at least, about or any language outside of the USSR about Dungan literature generally. So it's very much terra incognita, very fresh and very important topic. I'm not even familiar with any graduate students working on this topic right now, although maybe there are some, I don't think so. So you really are the man. And I want to put in a pitch for the book here, including the link to the book here. And Kenneth tells me there is a coupon for it if you want to buy it. It's Yin 30, you can get 30% off the book. So, and I hadn't seen the book, but it looks very attractive, the cover and everything. You just held it up. So thanks again, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm gonna, so as you just heard, I will be speaking about my new book, Dungan Folktales and Legends. And this was published last year in 2021 by Peter Lang as part of its International Folkloristics series. And so I'm going to share. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. Okay, and so the title of today's talk is Dungan Folktales and Legends, the folkloric narrative tradition of the Sino-Muslims in Central Asia. So I'm going to start here. So you can all see the slides here. So I'm going to start here by speaking briefly about the significance of the study of the Dungan folkloric narrative tradition. So first of all, there is the existence of tale types not found in other folkloric traditions. Secondly, it forms the basis for the development of Dungan or Dungan written literature in the Soviet period. And third, it provides evidence for the complex ethnogenesis of the Dungan or Hui people, who are the Sinophone or Chinese-speaking Muslims of Central Asia and China, respectively. So in today's lecture, it's sort of broken into two parts. First, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to the Dungan people and language. And secondly, I would like to go into a discussion of general features of Dungan tales. And this is based on the research presented in my recent English language edition of the Dungan Folktales and Legends, which was originally published in Russian by Boris Riftin in 1977, and that is a structural and comparative analysis of the tales. So the Hui, or the Sinophone Muslims in China, are an ethno-religious group predominantly composed of Chinese-speaking Muslims who number approximately 10.5 million, according to the 2011 census, and they are distributed throughout China. mainly in the northwestern provinces and the Central Plain, or in Chinese, Zhongyuan region. The Hui are one of 56 ethnic groups officially recognized by the People's Republic of China. And the PRC government defines the Hui to include all historically Muslim communities not included in China's other ethnic groups. So now what you see on the screen is a map of the distribution of the Hui, or Muslim Chinese, in China. So as you see, they are distributed throughout China, but a lot of them are concentrated in northwestern China and in the Central Plain region here. You see. Now I'd like to talk about how the Dungans came to be in Central Asia from their place of origin in Northwest China. So basically, there have been three major waves of migration. The first was in the winter of 1877 to 1878, and this was in the immediate aftermath of the failed Dungan Revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877 under the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. The second major wave was from 1881 to 1884. And this was following the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881, which restored to China the upper Ili Basin in Xinjiang, which had been occupied by Russian troops since 1871 during the Dungan Revolt. And this information all comes from Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakoff-Dyer. And finally, the third and the latest wave of migration took place in the first part of the 20th century until the border was closed in the early 1960s. And this was following the Great Chinese Famine, which lasted roughly from 1959 to 1961. This third wave is much less documented than the first two. A few facts about the Dungans in Central Asia. So by tradition, they are Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school, like most of their Central Asian neighbors. So most of the original Dungan settlers were poor illiterate peasants or small urban craftsmen from Turpan in Xinjiang, from Gansu province, and from Shanxi province in China. In terms of family structure, the Dungans have traditionally had large families, often with between 6 and 8 children, and they enjoy a reputation as a hardworking and prosperous people. And one of the reasons for their prosperity in Central Asia is the agricultural methods that they in fact imported from China to Central Asia when they arrived. So they are known as very good growers of many sort of popular produce in Central Asia. If you have a chance to go there, you will see that. So in terms of the numbers of Dungans, according to the latest census data available as of 2020, there are an estimated 150,000 Dungans. And this is the figure that I give in my recent publication. So they live primarily in the following regions. So first, in Kyrgyzstan, there are approximately 74,000 according to the 2020 Kyrgyz census. And they live also in Kazakhstan. There were slightly over 72,000 according to the 2019 Kazakh census. And then there are approximately 3,000 Dungans in Uzbekistan. And this is according to 2009 estimates of the Dungan Cultural Center of Uzbekistan. And more recently, beginning only in 2000, there has been a migration of Dungans from Central Asia to Saratov Oblast, which is located in the southeast of European Russia. And the number is slightly over 16,000 counted in the 2010 Russian census. And this area in Saratov Oblast was an area that had been inhabited previously by German immigrants to Russia, but then that they left, and the Dungans saw that it was actually quite fertile ground for growing products, and they started to move in. And the numbers have only increased since 2010. What you see now is a map showing the distribution of the Dungans in Central Asia. So you could see there in the green hatched area, right? They're mainly in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and then Eastern Uzbekistan. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the language situation with the Dungans. So when the Dungans originally migrated to Central Asia, they did not have a written form. They rejected the use of Chinese characters, but they did have use of what's called Xiao'erjing, which is a Perso-Arabic script that was originally used by the Dungans and is still used by other Hui in China, but primarily for religious purposes, religious annotations. And what you see on the screen now is an excerpt from a Chinese Arabic Xiao'erjing trilingual dictionary that was published in 1955 in Shanghai. So this Xiao'erjing literally means children's script in Chinese or minor script. And as I said, it was primarily used, however, for annotating religious texts prior to the Soviet period. Roper. So what happened during the Soviet period is what happened to many other minority languages which did not have a standardized written form prior to the Soviet period. There was initial experimentation for the Dungan language with two different versions of a Latin alphabet. And so this went on from 1928 to roughly 1953. At the bottom of your screen, you see the 1928 version of the Latin alphabet, and on top, the 1932 version of the alphabet with some modifications. So during the years here, 1928 to 1929, as the Kyrgyzs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic-speaking peoples of the Soviet Union were adopting the Latinized alphabet known as the New Turkic alphabet or New Alphabet, the Dungans adopted a Latinized alphabet based on the New Turkic alphabet, but adapted for languages of peoples of non-Turkic origin. So as you can probably imagine, the New Turkic alphabet did not suit the sounds of Dungans particularly well, because of course, the Dungan or the Dungan language is a Sinitic language or language related to Chinese. It is in fact a dialect of Mandarin. So by 1932, the new Latin Hua began to replace the first Latin alphabet. So the Latin Hua movement was spurred on by the fact that Muscovite political workers at the Scientific Research Institute on China, a unit of the Communist Academy, were joined by highly qualified linguists and sinologists from the Academy of Sciences in Leningrad. So what you see now on the screen is the Cyrillic alphabet that has been adopted for the Dungan language. And it was adopted between 1953 and 1955, and is still in use to this day. So it, as you see on the screen, it contains all 33 letters of the Russian alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet, as well as 5 additional letters. So from 1939 on, the Cyrillic alphabet gradually replaced the various Latin alphabets for all the national minority languages in the Soviet republics of Central Asia. So the most important motivation for this switch was the desire of the Soviet government to facilitate making Russian a unified language of the USSR by having a single alphabet taught in elementary schools for Russian and the minority languages. With the change delayed in some areas by the war and its aftermath, however, the implementation of a new Dungan alphabet based on the Russian script with 5 additional letters didn't occur until 1953. And it took until 1955 until a final version was adopted of that particular alphabet, which is still in use to this day. Just a few facts about the modern Dungan language. So Dungan is notably the only Sinitic or Chinese language that is officially written using an alphabet, or in linguistics, what's called a morphophonemic system, instead of Chinese characters, which constitute a morphosyllabic system. So there has been quite a bit of attention from the scholarly community focused on the Dungan language and Dungan linguistics because of this very unusual fact. An internal diglossic situation stems from the fact that the Dungans are divided between the Gansu dialect, spoken mainly in Kyrgyzstan, because that's the part of China, the province where these immigrants arrive from, Gansu province, and then the Shanxi dialect, predominantly spoken in Kazakhstan by those who came from the Shanxi province in China, while nearly half of the young generation today has no mastery of Dungan and can only speak Russian and sometimes also Kyrgyz or Kazakh. And this comes from Laurel L. and Peyrus, 2009. So the Dungan language is listed by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, commonly known as UNESCO, as what's called a definitely endangered language. And that is a language where the speakers are primarily of the parental generation. Now I'd like to turn our attention to the study that I'd like to discuss. So this classic Russian language study that I translated and annotated for my recent publication, and which first appeared in Russian in 1977, was led by Boris Lvovich Rivsin, who lived from 1932 to 2012. He is considered a pioneer in the study of Chinese popular literature, folklore, and visual culture. He was a doctor of philological sciences and was in fact known to many as Li Fuqing, his Chinese pen name, because he was so fluent in Chinese that he authored more than a few works in Chinese. The second of the 3 collaborators on the Russian language edition, which appeared first in 1977, is Mahmoud Ahmedovich Hasanov, who lived from 1932 to 1977. He was a Dungan writer, literary scholar, and candidate of philological sciences. So he's considered a leading expert in Dungan folklore, as well as an influential Soviet Dungan or Dungan prose writer of the 1960s and 1970s. And he also happened to be fluent in both the Gansu and the Shanxi dialects of Dungan, which helped greatly in the both the collection and the translation of the tales for the volume in question. Finally, the third collaborator on the classic Russian language study is Ilyas Ismailovich Yusupov, who lived from 1930 until 2005. So he was a Dungan historian and candidate of historical sciences. And he was a prolific researcher in Dungan history and philology, who published more than 100 scholarly works during his lifetime. So hopefully, with these brief profiles that I provided of the three researchers, you see that they had very far-ranging interests in addition to their interest and expertise in the folklore itself. Just a few comments about this classic 1977 Russian language edition, Dunganskiy Narodny Сказки и Предания, Dungan Folktales and Legends. So it is a collection of 78 stories translated from Dungan into Russian by Riftin, Hasanov, and Yusupov. It was under the editorship of Riftin and includes a scholarly introduction and analysis by Riftin and Hasanov. It was published in 1977, as I mentioned, by Nauka Publishers in Moscow as part of its series titled Tales and Myths of Eastern Peoples. And it received quite a bit of attention at that time, and not the least for its inclusion in that particular series. Since that time, there have been other editions of these Dungan tales with critical analysis. So there have been two other Russian language editions of the Dungan tales. One is a second edition published in 2013, and another is an abridged edition that appeared in 2018 that only includes those Dungan tales in the original edition that had been translated by Riftin himself. And there was also been a Chinese language edition that was published in 2011 under the editorship of Riftin, using his Chinese pen name Li Fuqing and translated by Haifeng. And this was published by the Shanghai Literature and Art Publishing House. So, and then of course, my English language edition, which just appeared in 2021, as I mentioned, which is with Peter Lang, part of its International Folkloristics series, volume 16. So now I'd like to turn our attention to the in-depth structural and comparative analysis of Dungan folk narratives conducted by Riftin, Hasanov, and Yusupov, and appearing in the classic Russian language edition, which first appeared in 1977. So the 78 folk narratives that serve as the basis for the study appear in their entirety and are organized according to the Arne-Thompson folktale classification system in both the Russian language edition of 1977, Dunganskiy Narodny Сказки и Предания, and my 2021 English language edition. The findings indicate that Dungan folk stories are firmly rooted in Chinese storytelling traditions, but also exhibit substantial Middle Eastern, East Asian, and Central Asian influence, as you will see now. So first, I'd like to show you the three chapters in terms of the thematic groupings of these Dungan tales as they appear in both the first Russian language edition and also in my 2021 English language edition. So the first major grouping of the three is wonder tales and animal tales. And this includes 40 of the 78 selections. You can see the first 20 there. And the next 20. The second major grouping of the tales is what's called novelistic tales, folk anecdotes, and adventure stories. And this chapter or section comprises 27 selections. The selections 56, 57, or 60 are ones where the storyteller did not specifically assign a title. So that was assigned by in the 1977 original Russian language edition based on the major topic or theme of the tale. And finally, the third chapter or section is what's called legends, historical tales, and narratives. In Russian, skazy, so narratives, colloquial narratives. And this comprises 11 selections of the 78, but many of these are the longer selections in the collection. Okay, so now I'd like to briefly speak about each of the 8 general features of the Dungan folk narratives that have been identified by Riften and his collaborators. So first, a few comments about tale typology. So basically, Dungan categorization of oral prose narratives is into 2 types. Shorter and longer type tales. So the shorter tales, which in Dungan are called gujier, or typical folk tales, and then the other category is what's called faux in Dungan, and this could be compared with Beijing shuoshu, or storytelling to music, literally in Chinese book stories. Or those with a basis in the Chinese literary tradition. Second, a few comments about the origins of the Dungan folk narratives. So there are Far Eastern and Near Eastern sources for the tales, reflecting the complex ethnogenetic and cultural ties of the Dungans. There's also a down-to-earth nature of the fiction of the Dungan tale, especially a wonder tale. And this links it to the folklore of Far Eastern peoples. The action in Dungan tales, as for instance in Chinese tales, takes place not in some distant and unknown realm, a land of fantasy, but rather all the uncommon occurrences happen with the hero nearby, in places native and familiar to the storyteller. Third, I'd like to make a few comments about narrative time in the Dungan tales. So there is a general lack of localization in time in the Dungan stories. And this is in contrast to the tales of a number of peoples of the Far East. For example, the Chinese and Koreans, who are generally inclined toward legend or tradition, which often specifically indicate the time of the action. For instance, during a particular dynasty or under a particular ruler, a particular story happens. In Dungan tales, wonder tales, and everyday tales, whose connection with legend is considerably weaker, these kinds of introductions localizing the action in time are hardly ever found. The tale usually begins simply with words like nar huar you, meaning there once was, or shun wan yan you, meaning in the old days there was, thus attributing the action to an indefinite past time. Fourth, I'd like to make a few comments about physical landscape. So the world of the Dungan tale has its own specific landscape. So for example, you will see frightening and dangerous mountains. Interestingly, however, there is no mention of the frightful forest that we see so often in European tales. There is also mention of the plain, which is often inferred, however, rather than specifically described. Then there is also mention of the sea, but interestingly, no lakes or rivers. And for example, one of the seas that's very often mentioned is the East China Sea, which is where the Dragon King, or Lun Wan in Dungan, dwells. And finally, there is plenty of mention of cities. And when a city is mentioned in a Dungan tale, it is usually, however, an abstract, quaint Chinese city rather than a specifically named one. Fifth, I'd like to make a few comments about common character types. So in these Dungan tales, you will see farmers, shepherds, petty traders, woodcutters, hunters, keepers of coaching inns, bandits, officials, and sovereigns. There is scant mention, however, of craftsmen, of whom there were many before among the Dungans, but frequent mention of petty traders, for example, owners of small shops, or those walking around the villages with a yoke and baskets, selling fabrics, decorations, or other trifles. There is also the prevalence of coaching inns, with their innkeepers and assorted guests as the place where the action in many tales occurs. Then we also see several different kinds of immortals. For example, Shen Xian, who is always a positive character. This is a character taken over from the Chinese tradition. There's also mention of the holy Hizir, whose depiction is typical in Near Eastern and Central Asian folklore. And then, of course, we have plenty of mention of fantastical characters. So there are monsters, for instance, elementally linked with Far Eastern mythology. For example, shape-shifting jinn who seduce their victims, and that comes from the Chinese tradition. You guai, also from the Chinese tradition, who forcefully abduct people, and then Ye Mao Ren, also from the Chinese tradition, which would be the hairy, wild man cannibal, as I translate it into English. Then there are monsters common in Central Asian folklore. For example, Menguzi, a seven-handed monster who can be compared with Mongolian mongoose and Gansu Mongol Manguzi. And then there are characters of the Near Eastern and Middle Eastern mythological sphere. For example, giants Dai Wuzi, whose name is derived from the Iranian Dev. And then there is, as I already mentioned, the Dragon King, Lun Wan, the master of water, whose depiction emerged on Far Eastern soil, but under the influence of Indo-Buddhist mythological religious beliefs. And then finally, there are characters linking Dungan folklore with the Turkic. For example, Tuzi, a bald head or mangy person. And this can be compared with Old Turkic Taz, a cunning trickster or lucky cheat. And then you see also in these Dungan tales, familial relations exemplifying the ideal of filial piety and punishment for undutiful children. And this has been mainstreamed under the influence of Confucianism. Six, I'd like to make a few comments about individual motifs and plots in the Dungan tales. So there is the depiction of the societal relations of Old China in modified form in these tales. For example, heroes or protagonists encountering officials or emperors who seem closer to the common people than in the comparable tales of the Chinese. And then there is frequent reference to two kingdoms and two sovereigns, respectively. And this is possibly preserving memories of the periods of temporary fragmentation in China in the Middle Ages, or memories of ancient tribal chiefs or clan leaders in the south of China. This is according to Wolfram Eberhard in 1937. Or perhaps the borrowing of plots from the folklore of neighboring non-Far Eastern peoples, presumably mainly Turkic peoples. And then we see the hero or protagonist very often going straight to the capital and easily obtaining the title of Zhuanyuan, or number one scholar, in what is depicted as a much less complex system of government examinations than in reality. And this is a possible link between the popularity of the Zhuanyuan in Dungan tales and the influence of Chinese ancient drama and the traditional auspicious popular print, according to Riften and Hassanov. Then there is an often positive and deferential attitude towards the Yuan Wai, a typical character in the Dungan tale, who can be compared with the Pomeshchik of the Russian tale. There is also the infrequent appearance of the Ahun, a Muslim clergyman who can be compared with a mullah, and whose depiction is never found in Chinese folklore or Far Eastern folklore generally. And then we have folklore characters of neighboring peoples readily entering the world of the Dungan tale. For example, lamas, Buddhist monks, and Taoist monks, who can all identify shapeshifters and fight them with the help of different spells and other magical means. Seventh, I would like to make a few comments about color symbolism in the Dungan tales. So red and green are portrayed as bright colors, scaring away evil spirits and protecting from adversity. So these are colors that can be seen in the bride's attire, in the paint on the wagons before a long treacherous journey, and the horse harness, for example. White is the color of mourning among the Dungans and the Chinese. White is also associated with fantastical animals. For example, a white snake, a white rabbit, a white horse, and these animals typically help the hero or protagonist in the tale. Black is mainly applied to negative colors and phenomena. So for example, a black snake, a black whirlwind, a black fool, and being an abusive form of address for the Dragon King. Yellow is a color portending doom in the Dungan tales. So for example, there might be mention of a yellow whirlwind carrying the heroine away, or a yellow countenance indicating contact with a vampire shapeshifter. And finally, blue and the closely related green are colors associated with dark forces. For example, there will be mention of a monster's blue or green face, green smoke accompanying the appearance of a monster, or the soul of the hero or enemy ascending into the sky with a trickle of blue smoke. Eighth and finally, I'd like to make a few comments about number symbolism in the Dungan tales. So 3 is a number that is often mentioned in the tales, and it is typical in the epic storytelling of various peoples, in fact. 7 is another number often mentioned, and it is more peculiar to Far Eastern folklore. 72 is another number that is often mentioned. Then there is also frequent mention of 9 and its derivatives, especially 99. Often mentioned, for example, 99 people destroyed by an evil monk in a tale, or 99 iron chariots thrown into a river by a hero warrior. All of these having 9 as the base odd or masculine number that formed the basis for counting in ancient China. And then finally, 40 is a number occupying a special place in Dungan folklore, apparently entering it from the Near Eastern cultural tradition. So here you may recall the Near Eastern tale, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the Dungan version, Stories of 40 Viziers. And then for other examples are the hero performing for the Dragon King for 40 days and nights, or all kinds of events transpiring 40 days after a wedding or death of a hero or protagonist's parents. Finally, I just have a list of the references that I use in today's PowerPoint presentation. So as I mentioned already, Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer. In addition to the 2 works that I mentioned, she has also produced several other monographs in English on Dungan literature and culture history. Wolfram Eberhard. I also cited Marlène Laruelle and Sebastian Pérouse, and also Christopher Mosley. Of course, Boris Lvovich-Riftin, with Hasanov and Yusupov as co-compilers and co-translators, Jeffrey Roper, and myself. If you would like any further information about the Dungans or anything else that I'm doing after today, please feel free to email me at kyin@lagcc.cuny.edu, or visit my professional website at kjy.georgetown.domains. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much, Kenneth.
You're welcome.
Fascinating talk. Well, I'll start out with one question, which is, do you consider this to be linguistics or literature or history, or all 3?
Oh, great question. With literature, I guess all 3 really are involved in the project: linguistics, literature, and also history. So yeah, I mean, for me, it was the desire after reading the classic Russian language edition to just make these sort of just wonderfully colorful and vibrant tales available to an English-speaking public, in addition to raising the visibility of Dungan people and culture among the Anglophone world, so to speak. But from there, also realizing how important the understanding and the study of the Dungan folklore is to understanding the emergence and development of Soviet Dungan literature, and then, of course, post-Soviet literature as well. So all of those connections, really, in that sense.
Wonderful. Other questions?
Kenneth, will you tell us where was your starting point in learning all of these languages?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I got my start with the Dungans when I first learned of them in the late summer, early fall of 1991, when I was a graduate student in linguistics at Georgetown University. And I was searching for a topic that I could maybe write a graduate research paper on, or possibly a thesis, master's thesis, something like that. And I saw a reference in an obscure monograph at the time, and I later found out that that there was this group that was using a language that was Chinese, a dialect of Mandarin or standard Chinese, but that they had rejected the use of Chinese characters since they migrated to Central Asia, and that they were therefore using the Cyrillic alphabet since the 1950s, as I mentioned. And then later I was able to get a hold of a few actual texts, like children's books at first, that were written in the Dungan language. And when I saw it, I was just electrified because I could actually understand a lot of it, being able to read Chinese and also Russian. And then just the whole story about the Dungan sort of migration and their history and everything. It was just so fascinating for me that I knew at that time that it was definitely something that I would be exploring and talking about for a long, long time. But it took a while for me after 1991 until I could get a hold of enough materials to actually be able to, for example, write this English language edition of the Classic Russian Language Study, which only appeared last year, although I started in 2005. Because 1991 was actually pre-internet for people that are too young to know. I believe the internet first appeared in 1995. So I had to wait a few years to get a hold of all of these materials. But I am actually Chinese American, which is why Chinese was actually spoken in my household. But then I also began studying it as an undergraduate Chinese language, in addition to my major in Russian and Soviet studies at the time. So those have always been my two main interests, and very naturally, Central Asia is now one of my research interests, as well as Siberia and the Russian Far East. And part of the conversation of Russo-Chinese cultural context as well here. So yeah, but thank you so much for your question. I hope I didn't say too much with that.
Oh, that was great. Thank you. Amazing that you had the initial skills to find the Dungan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is sort of a small sort of world, if you will, of people who are studying this. I was just, yeah. So it's just been so wonderful with this book being published in last year in 2021, that I've been able to make contact with really the international community of Dungan scholars, because it's drawn so much attention to the research that I'm doing. Of course, with all of these opportunities for talks as well, which I'm so grateful for, and people like yourself who are interested in it and spreading the word.
Can I ask another question?
Absolutely, please do.
You just made me think, you highlighted the Dungan population around mainland China and then in Central Asia, but do you have a sense of diaspora population outside of that area?
Right. So specifically for the Dungans you're talking about, correct? Yeah. So yeah, they mainly settled in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And more recently, there has been a migration across the border into Saratov Oblast, which is in the southeastern part of Russia. And that's very interesting because that's actually a growing sort of migration so that number was 1,651 as of the 2010 census. And it's growing, with small numbers, but it's sort of growing from what I sort of heard. Yeah. But it's interesting because the people that I'm investigating, the groups I'm investigating now, the Tungus peoples over in Siberia and the Russian Far East, although that's not a diaspora per se, I see so many parallels between the research that I'm doing with the Dungans and, for example, the Nanai or the Udiga, whose literature and cultures I'm also starting to research now.
I'm sorry, who are those? The Nanai and the Udige, you said? Who are
those?
The
Nanai and the Udige. Yeah, Nanai, N-A-N-A-I, and the Udige, U-D-E-G-E. Or their name for themselves is Udihe, U-D-I-H-E. But it's usually transliterated from the Russian, U-D-E-G-E.
Wow.
Yeah. And with the Nanai are particularly interesting because there's a very large number also on the Chinese side of the border, because they were in Manchuria, and then when the Manchuria was split in the mid 1800s, between the border was redefined, so to speak, in 1858 with the Treaty of Aigun and then the Treaty of Peking in 1860. Much of that part, what was considered outer Manchuria by China, went to Russia. So the fate of these Nanai, it's very interesting, are so different now, depending on which side of the border they happen to end up on after 1860. Yeah.
There are just all these stories that are just buried under the dominant narratives of Soviet and Chinese and 20th century history. And these stories are as important and much more interesting than the stories we usually hear from historians.
Right, exactly.
They're all about, the stuff you'd expect it to be about.
Right, and the Udiga were often lumped together in the early, even through much of the early part of the 20th century with the Tungus or the Nanai in general. The Soviets were actually trying to limit the number of officially recognized minority peoples. So I think this is one of those cases where they realized there was a sort of a separate group, for example, the Udiga, but they're so small, there's only about 1,500 of them presently, that they didn't specifically give the document them or give them a label officially, but that they sort of knew they existed, but more recently they've been now considered a separate sort of group. So it's just really interesting. A lot of these Tungus peoples, when you study one, you're really studying the other, but literally, because a lot of the earlier references, late 1800s or early 1900s, mid 1900s even, are really to the Tungus peoples, as it's called, right? And not necessarily to the specific group, or to perhaps the larger groups like the Nanai, but they actually may also be talking about other groups such as the Udiga, perhaps, or other of the Tungus peoples. So the nomenclature is always very interesting and complicated subject, of course. Yeah.
Yes, Zohra, please go ahead.
Hi, that was such a fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Ken, for
thank you.
letting me know about it. This is really wonderful. I do know one thing with the yellow, hold on, let me lower my hand, with the yellow reference, only because I know my Dungani friends are always identifying more with the Persian, a sort of a Persian past. Yellow is always with Zoroastrianism, illness and sickness, and then the red of the fire. So when we do jump over for Nowruz, over the fire, you're leaving your yellow behind and like taking in the red of the fire. So I thought it was interesting that all the yellow references were for sickness or yellow face. It comes from the Persian words too. When you're sick, your face is yellow, zard. So that was fascinating. Yeah, I really love this talk. Thank you for this.
What is the Persian word for yellow? Or
Zard. Z-A-R. Well, I mean, in the English, it would be Z-A-R-D. Yellow.
DCAR? Okay,
Mhm.
very interesting. Thank you for adding that
Yeah.
piece of information. Yeah. Yellow pretending to.
Kenneth, I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
I felt like you referenced Islam several times, but you didn't really mention it. So what is the role of Islam here in Dungan?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So in the in that scholarly introduction by Riftin and Hassanov to the original Russian language edition, there is actually a brief discussion of the Islamic elements in the stories, which seem to be fewer, for example, than the, let's say, the Chinese elements or other elements in the tales. And what Riftin and Hassanov say is that perhaps it's because in the specific milieu which they're in, which in Central Asia among their Islamic neighbors, it's really perhaps the Chineseness or the Chinese elements of their traditions that really distinguish them or set them apart. So perhaps that is why those seem to be more salient, if you will, in the folk tales, the folklore, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, yeah. Very
but there
interesting.
definitely are references to Islam or Islamic characters, or a mosque or Islamic eating house that has an Arabic sign on it, things like that I didn't necessarily mention today. You see these throughout the tales. They sort of can't be missed, so to speak, but they're not always like the focus necessarily of the tales, right? But I did mention, some of the Ahun, for example, is one of the, but not one of those characters, a Mola, if you will, that's mentioned. But again, it's sort of infrequently, but something that you wouldn't see, for example, in a Chinese type tale.
Yeah. Kenneth, the next question is from the business manager in the Department of African Diaspora Studies, who also happens to be my wife, Lola, and a native of Uzbekistan.
Oh, wow. So nice to meet you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful talk, Kenneth. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think something gets lost in translations when folklore tales get translated from one language to another?
Oh, sure. That's a wonderful question. Yeah, I mean, I think in translation in general, right? You have to you have to try to do your best to find an equivalent in the target language for what you're trying to bring over from the source text, correct? And it's not simply, of course, a question of language or the words. There's a lot more than that. There's the style, there's the of the source text, there's the historical context, right? All and so on and so on. So yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think you can ever have. I think you can have better translations or sort of like not so good translations. You can improve upon them, but I think there's always is something that's lost in some ways. Although I feel very fortunate as a sort of a scholarly type writer, where I am able to include annotations, which sometimes are quite lengthy, to fill in information that I feel that an English-speaking reader might not know, but that like a Russian-speaking reader would know, or a Dungan-speaking reader would know. But on the other hand, I think with sometimes the translation perhaps can add some things on the other hand, that perhaps are not in the source text, but right, in some ways as well. Actually, I've heard about that with translation in general, that there have sometimes been authors of original works who commented that the translations that have been made of their works are actually better than the original works. I sort of read, I read about that, which is interesting. I mean, but that made me think how you can actually sometimes, represent maybe certain things better than the original writer, who may be sometimes taking things for granted in some sort of ways, perhaps, right? So yeah, I think it's of course a very challenging task, the translation, but it's so rewarding, it's so stimulating and just so rewarding. And being able to present these ideas and stories, cultures, histories to an audience that otherwise would not have access to it. It's such a wonderful feeling to be able to do that. I'm sure for any translator would say that, and I just feel the same way with the work that I'm doing. Yeah. But thank you for that great question.
Oh, thank you.
Do you do translation yourself, by the way? Can I ask you?
I don't. It's just I grew up with Uzbek and Russian folklore tales. And
okay.
sometimes I try to tell the same story to somebody else in English. And I noticed that it loses some meaning. Even if I try to translate very literally, it just doesn't come out the same in English. So, but I was just curious. I mean, I'm not a professional translator, but it really loses its unique meaning. It's like sort of like a spice to it,
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. And you're also bringing in the oral component, of course, like interpreting, I guess, technically, right? You're sort of interpreting the tale, right, in a sense, right?
Exactly.
And yeah, so that added dimension sort of the moving across the different languages and different cultures. Absolutely. But I think it's wonderful that you're doing that in whatever way, even though you would like it to be maybe better or something. I think it's a wonderful start anyway. Be talking about it, that could lead to other things and maybe more polished written translations if you decide to do that and things like that, or just sparking people's interest. I think it's just so important, and just making them aware even of these different tales and the excitement.
Exactly.
So wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Kenneth, you're a wonderful speaker and a wonderful scholar, and you must you must be amazing in the classroom as well, I have to imagine.
Indeed.
Oh, I hope so.
I wish we had more people like you over here.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
So I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation, and would really love to have you. You mentioned you're working on another book. I'd love to have you come here in person next time.
Oh, that's a definite possibility.
Get an in-person exposure to some of your energy.
Sure. I would love that.
So thanks so much, Kenneth.